He was a sharply dressed black traveler who'd paid full price for the best seat on the plane, ready to enjoy the quiet luxury that first class promised. But the moment he stepped to the counter, everything changed. Smirks, eye rolls, thinly veiled insults delivered like customer service. And it didn't stop there. What began as a single humiliating encounter spiraled into something much uglier, exposing the casual cruelty of those who thought they were untouchable, and the hidden power of the man they tried to put in his place. Stay with this series to see how one flight, one cruel laugh, and one man's resolve would bring an entire empire to its knees. If this story pulls you in, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell. Kenton Price adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit jacket, the crisp white shirt underneath freshly pressed, his green silk tie perfectly centered. He was the picture of calm, methodical efficiency as he approached the Horizon Airlines counter. The terminal bustled with early morning travelers, and the overhead speakers droned with gate change announcements and boarding calls. But he tuned it all out, laser-focused on getting through check-in smoothly. He was early, as always. He liked to have time to review notes before boarding. The carry-on at his side was compact but expensive, black leather polished to a shine. He even checked his reflection in a darkened window on the way to the counter to ensure everything was in order. The line for priority and first class moved quickly, and when it was finally his turn, he stepped up confidently and handed over his phone with the digital boarding pass. "Morning," he said politely, voice smooth but clipped. Trina Calloway didn't bother returning the courtesy. She was in her mid-40s, hair scraped back into a bun, so tight it looked like it hurt. Her mouth was pinched, the lipstick too bright on her thin lips. Her gaze traveled over him slowly, head to toe, lingering with deliberate scrutiny on his face and hands. Her lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. She didn't even try to hide it. She leaned forward just slightly, letting her voice ring a bit louder than necessary. "First class, huh?" she said, raising her eyebrows theatrically. "You sure you can afford it?" The words weren't just for him. They were for the people waiting in line behind him. The man in business casual behind him actually huffed a laugh, looking down and shaking his head. An older couple to his left openly turned to watch. Kenton felt their stares like pinpricks on the back of his neck. He inhaled once, controlling the flush rising to his cheeks. He was used to slights, microaggressions, careful code words, but this wasn't subtle. This was public, designed to humiliate. He kept his voice even, his expression neutral. "Yes," he said calmly. "First class. Boarding pass is there." She snatched the phone from his hand, almost dropping it before catching it by the corner, twisting it toward the screen, as if it might burn her. She squinted at the screen so hard the bright overhead lights reflected off her reading glasses. She turned the phone over once, then back, as if searching for a forgery. "Well, isn't this something?" she muttered. Then, louder, "We get all kind these days." She glanced at her co-worker at the next podium, a pudgy man named Steve whose tie was crooked. "Steve, check this out," she called, voice mocking. "First-class passenger." Steve didn't bother looking up. He just gave a grunt of acknowledgement, but that didn't stop her. She smirked at Kenton directly now, and her tone went from condescending to overtly cruel. "I mean, sure, if you say so," she said, lifting one brow in an exaggerated expression of doubt. Kenton's hands curled into fists at his sides. He unclenched them deliberately. He was aware of every eye on him now. The man behind him shifted impatiently but kept listening. The older woman clucked her tongue softly, disapproving, but not at Trina. At Kenton. "Is there a problem?" Kenton asked, voice tight but even. "Problem," she repeated, voice lilting with false innocence. "Oh no, no problem. I just want to be sure you're in the right line. We wouldn't want any confusion." Then she barked a laugh that was as sharp as it was humorless. A few people in line snickered. Kenton felt a pulse in his temple. He watched her scan the boarding pass slowly, deliberately dragging out the process. The scanner beeped. Green. Clear. She couldn't even hide it now, but she didn't hand it back. Instead, she turned it sideways, holding it up to the light like a bodega clerk checking a $20 bill. Then she snorted. "Well, look at that." Guess it's not fake. She didn't hand it back, so much as fling it. It slapped lightly against his palm, slipping toward the counter before he caught it. Her lips twisted into a cruel little grin. "Congratulations," she added, voice thick with sarcasm. Then she turned to Steve again, rolling her eyes so dramatically it was almost theatrical. "Guess they'll let anyone up front these days." Steve snorted without looking. Kenton's face remained calm, but his heart hammered in his chest. He was used to microaggressions. This wasn't that. This was naked contempt. He could see it in her eyes. She wanted to humiliate him. She wanted him to react, to raise his voice, to make a scene so she could call security. He wouldn't give her that. He took a long breath. He pressed the boarding pass flat on the counter, smoothing it carefully with his palm. Then he picked up his phone, slowly and deliberately. He met her eyes. "Thank you for your help," he said in a voice so even it was almost icy. Her grin faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, my pleasure," she cooed. Then, voice suddenly crisp and professional. "Next." She practically barked it, ignoring him as he gathered his things. Kenton turned on his heel. He didn't look back, but as he walked toward the security checkpoint, he could hear her voice, lower now, but still audible, talking to Steve. Entitled. "Think they own the place. Makes me sick." Steve mumbled something he couldn't catch, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The line behind him buzzed with whispers. He felt all of them at his back, crawling like ants under his collar. He kept walking, every step deliberate. "Congratulations." He forced himself to exhale slowly, reminding himself that it was over. Or so he thought. He walked toward gate 17 with his boarding pass in one hand, checking his watch with the other. He was early. He'd made sure of it. Even with that humiliating delay at the counter, he still had time. He didn't want to have to stand in line for boarding with everyone else crowding forward, elbowing for space. He was first class. That was what he'd paid for. He deserved it, and he would use it. He took a seat in one of the sleek metal chairs near the gate, pulling out his phone, trying to find a calm moment to review his presentation notes. He scanned charts and deal memos, the words blurring slightly as his eyes kept drifting back to the memory of Trina's mocking smile. He shook his head, trying to clear it, telling himself to focus on what mattered. He was here to do business. That was what counted. A quiet electronic chime sounded overhead, snapping him out of his thoughts. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin boarding for Horizon Airlines Flight 372 to Chicago. At this time, we invite our first-class passengers and premium loyalty members to board." He stood immediately, sliding a phone into his pocket. He gathered his carry-on, checked his boarding pass one more time even though he knew it by heart, and walked to the gate. The line for first class was short, just 3 people ahead of him. He watched as a young white man in a fleece vest and khakis breezed past, nodding once at the attendant, who scanned him through with a cheerful welcome aboard. Next was a woman in her 60s wearing a tailored suit and a chunky gold necklace, who was greeted with polite small talk. Then a man in business formal who barely glanced at the gate agent as he was waved through. Kenton was next. He stepped forward, presenting his boarding pass confidently. He was prepared for the polite nod, the "thank you, sir," the standard professionalism. But his stomach dropped when he saw her, Trina Calloway. She had apparently left the counter to work the gate, and she was standing there, arms folded, scanning the line like a drill sergeant at inspection. Her gaze landed on him with immediate recognition, and her lips twisted into that same cruel smirk. She didn't even take his boarding pass. She held up a hand, palm out like a stop sign, making him halt in place. "Hold up," she snapped, voice loud enough to cut through the surrounding buzz. The entire boarding area seemed to hush. He blinked once. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Her smirk deepened. She took a single step forward, crowding into his space. "Priority boarding is for paying customers," she announced in a slow, deliberate drawl, as if speaking to a child or someone who didn't speak English. Murmurs rippled behind him. He felt heat rising to his face, but kept his breathing controlled. He held out the boarding pass. "I am a paying customer," he said firmly. "First class, seat 1A." She made no move to take the pass. Instead, she laughed. Laughed. A short, ugly bark of sound that startled even the people in line. "Oh, sure you are," she said mockingly. "We have rules, you know. We can't just let anyone board whenever they feel like it." He could see the people behind him, some smirking, others looking away awkwardly. The white man in the fleece vest, now standing just inside the jet bridge, actually turned back to watch with an amused smile. The woman with the gold necklace shook her head slightly, clucking her tongue like she was watching a child misbehave in church. Kenton's fingers tightened around the handle of his carry-on. He forced his voice to stay even. "Please scan my pass," he said, carefully enunciating every word. She sniffed dismissively. "You don't have to get aggressive," she said loudly. "I'm just doing my job." Another murmur from the line. Aggressive. The word felt like poison in his ears. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't moved. But she wanted them to think he was dangerous. He knew the script. He'd seen it before. She finally, slowly, took the pass and scanned it with an exaggerated slowness, eyes locked on his. The machine beeped green. He waited for her to step aside. She didn't. Instead, she squinted at the screen theatrically. "Huh," she said flatly. "Guess it says first class. Weird." Then she looked up and smiled, all teeth. "You sure you can afford it?" He swallowed hard. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears. He felt every eye on him. Every second was another drop of poison. He kept his voice low but firm. "Yes. May I board now?" She pursed her lips, pretending to consider. Then she tilted her head. "You know, you're really close to causing a disturbance," she said sweetly. "If you keep making trouble, I'll have to call security." That was what they wanted him to be. That was the script they were dying to see him play. He kept his breathing steady, eyes forward, refusing to look back at the people behind him who were still whispering, snickering. He could feel them like thorns pressed against his skin. When he reached the doorway of the plane, he paused for a split second to collect himself. The flight attendant waiting at the door gave him a bright, professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard, sir," she chirped, gesturing for him to enter. He nodded once, curtly, and stepped through. The cool blast of air conditioning hit his face. The cabin smelled of new leather and stale coffee. He let his eyes adjust to the dimmer light, the subtle gold and blue accents that marked this as the premium service they advertised so aggressively in their commercials. First class was nearly full already, and he felt every head turn as he entered. Most people looked away quickly, pretending to be busy with their phones or conversations. But he could feel their eyes, judging, calculating, measuring him. He ignored them, focused on his seat. 1A window. He would have preferred the aisle, but he wasn't about to make changes now. He walked toward it with a purposeful stride. He was halfway down the short aisle when he heard the voice. That voice, Trina Calloway. She was inside the cabin now, blocking the aisle ahead of him, arms folded across her chest, eyes narrowed. She hadn't given up her game. She just changed the arena. She let out a theatrical sigh when she saw him approach. "Oh, here we go," she muttered, just loud enough for the first few rows to hear. Kenton kept his head high. "Excuse me," he said firmly. "I'd like to get to my seat." She didn't move. Instead, she reached out suddenly, snatching the handle of his carry-on, jerking it toward herself with unnecessary force. He stumbled slightly but kept his balance, his fingers slipping off the leather as she yanked it away. "I'll take that," she said sharply, voice rising so everyone could hear. She twisted it in her hands, pretending to examine it. "And let's see that boarding pass again." Kenton blinked. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. He forced himself to speak evenly. "You already checked it. Twice." She sneered. "Yeah, well, I want to see it again. We have to make sure you actually belong here. Don't want any mistakes." He felt the entire cabin shift in uncomfortable silence. A man in 2C turned away quickly, pretending to adjust the air nozzle overhead. A woman in 1B stared openly, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Kenton took a deep breath. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, and handed her the boarding pass. Their fingers brushed. Hers were cold and stiff. She ripped it from his hand. She didn't scan it this time. She just held it up between two fingers like it was contaminated. "First class," she read aloud with a sarcastic emphasis. Then she turned her head slightly, addressing the cabin like a bad stage actor. "Look at that. He's actually in first class." A short, nervous laugh came from somewhere behind him. He didn't turn to see who it was. He just stared at her, meeting her eyes, refusing to drop his gaze. She held it for a second, then sniffed dismissively and shoved the boarding pass back at him. It bent slightly in her grip, creasing at the corner. "Congratulations," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Now move. You're holding up the line." She tossed his carry-on at him. He caught it against his chest, the force of it knocking him back a step. He steadied himself, adjusted his grip, and forced himself to walk around her. She didn't move much. He had to twist his shoulder sideways to squeeze past, their arms brushing, her perfume cloying and sharp. He reached his seat and paused. He was here. He'd made it. He set his carry-on down carefully, his hands shaking only slightly. He placed the boarding pass in the seat pocket, trying to smooth the crease out with his thumb. Then he lifted the bag to place it in the overhead bin. It was heavier than he'd like to admit. His arm trembled as he tried to raise it, his shoulder tight from stress. He paused, adjusted his grip, and tried again. He felt her behind him before she spoke. That same mocking tone. "Need help with that?" she asked loudly. He ground his teeth. He didn't want to give her this satisfaction, but the bag was awkward, his arm tired, and he was worried about hitting the person in 2A behind him. "If you could assist, please," he said, hating the way the words tasted in his mouth. She let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Do it yourself," she snapped, voice rising. He didn't dare look at the other passengers. He could feel their glances, the flickers of eyes quickly darting away when he shifted, the tight-lipped expressions that hovered between pity and disdain, as if they weren't sure whether to see him as the victim or the problem. Trina Calloway's voice still rang in his ears, that mocking taunt about, "You people always want everything handed to you," the deliberate cruelty wrapped in the thinnest veneer of customer service. He swallowed hard, pushing the memory down, focusing on slowing his breathing. He tried to remember why he was here. He tried to remember the deal waiting for him in Chicago, the boardroom table, the screen projecting his slides, the eyes on him waiting for his analysis. He would not let this moment undo years of work. He would not. But even as he forced himself to calm, he heard the clicking of hard-soled shoes coming back down the aisle. He tensed before he even looked up. She was coming back. Trina Calloway. Her posture was stiff with authority she wielded like a weapon, her eyes scanning the cabin with a proprietary gleam as if she owned it, as if everyone in it was on sufferance. She stopped at his row, bracing one hand on the seat across the aisle so she could lean in, her shadow falling across his lap. He didn't look up immediately. He couldn't, not without giving away how close he was to losing control. But she didn't care. She let the silence grow just enough to make everyone around them shift in their seats, to ensure they were listening. Then she cleared her throat with an exaggerated little cough. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "Sir, I'm going to need you to hold tight for a minute." He blinked and looked up finally, brow furrowing. "Hold tight," he asked, voice even but cold. She smiled, teeth bared, no warmth at all. "Yes," she said. "I need to check something." She didn't move. She didn't lower her voice. She stayed planted in the aisle, blocking it completely, one foot angled, so no one could get past. The passenger in 2A tried to stand to use the lavatory, but she lifted a hand to stop him, shaking her head. "Sorry, sir, just hold on. We've got a situation here," she said with feigned regret, casting a dramatic glance at Kenton before rolling her eyes, as if they shared some private joke about the inconvenience. The man sat back down with a harumph, glaring at Kenton as if he were the one causing the delay. Kenton's mouth opened. He closed it again. He forced himself to count to 5 in his head. She was baiting him. She wanted him to snap. Instead, he cleared his throat, careful to keep his voice level. "What exactly do you need to check?" She gave a short, humorless laugh. looking over her shoulder theatrically to make sure the passengers behind her could hear. "Just making sure you're supposed to be here," she drawled. "We wouldn't want to give out special treatment to people who didn't earn it, now would we?" A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone actually laughed, sharp and mean. Kenton felt something cold settle in his chest. His fingers dug into his knees so hard he could feel his nails through the fabric of his pants. "You already checked my boarding pass," he said quietly, dangerously calm. "Twice." She shrugged elaborately, still not moving. "Things change," she said airily. "Computer glitches. People try to sneak into first all the time." She said it as though describing the weather, but her gaze stayed locked on his face, daring him. The passenger across the aisle from him, a middle-aged man in a navy sport coat, leaned over slightly, eyes gleaming with voyeuristic interest. "Everything okay here?" he asked, faux polite, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Trina didn't miss a beat. She gestured at Kenton like he was an unruly child. "We're just making sure he's in the right seat," she said sweetly, voice rising so that even the people in economy craned their necks to see what the fuss was. Kenton felt his pulse hammer in his throat. He tried to swallow it down, his voice low and flat. "You're holding up boarding," he said. "Please let me be." She sniffed dismissively. "I'll move when I'm satisfied," she said, and then she actually turned slightly to address the rows behind her, gesturing at him with her thumb over her shoulder. "Sorry, folks. Priority means some of us get special treatment even if we don't deserve it." The laughter that erupted wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to slice through the last thin strand of his self-control. He felt his face burn hot, the sound buzzing in his ears like hornets. He looked away, jaw tight, lips pressed into a bloodless line. She finally shifted, letting the people behind him pass, but not before giving him one last smirk. "Enjoy your seat," she said sarcastically, moving down the aisle with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone watched her walk away victorious. He sat there rigid, his hands and fists on his lap, breathing shallow. He couldn't look at anyone, couldn't meet the eyes he felt on him like searchlights. He tried to focus on the instructions in the seat pocket, tried to read them word for word, but the words danced and blurred. The rage was too hot, too close. He was still trying to collect himself when she returned. He didn't hear her approach this time, too lost in the roar in his own head. Her voice snapped him out of it. "Sir," she said sharply. He kept his gaze locked ahead, refusing to give them the spectacle of his eyes glistening or his voice breaking. When he reached the curtain that marked the border between privilege and everyone else, he stopped. For just a moment, he paused and tried to breathe, summoning every ounce of discipline he'd honed over years of boardroom negotiations and corporate warfare to steady his voice. He turned slightly back toward Trina Calloway, who stood at the edge of the first-class cabin, arms folded, watching him with a satisfied gleam in her eyes, like a hunter savoring the moment before the kill. "I need to speak with a supervisor," Kenton said, his voice tight but controlled, each syllable crisp. Trina didn't move. She didn't blink. She just cocked her head slightly, her lips twisting into a cruel smirk. "You're speaking to me," she said, deliberately loud enough that the nearby rows could hear. A snicker bubbled from somewhere behind a seatback. Kenton inhaled sharply through his nose. He felt the words boiling in his throat, the rebuttal, the condemnation, the threat of lawyers and press and public shaming. But he forced it down like bile. Instead, he said, "I want your supervisor." Now, Trina rolled her eyes dramatically, sighing like a put-upon teenager. Then she pressed the intercom button near the galley wall and said in an exaggeratedly sweet voice, "Caleb, could you come here a second? We have a guest who needs special attention." She didn't wait for a response. She stepped back to let the show unfold. Kenton could hear the sound of shuffling feet approaching. The curtain between first and business snapped aside, and in stepped Caleb Wright. Caleb was a big man, broad in the shoulders, his crisp airline uniform stretched slightly over his gut. He projected that forced corporate calm, the brand of leadership that only had two speeds, condescension or threat. He smiled when he saw Kenton, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Good afternoon, sir," Caleb said, voice oily smooth. loud enough to ensure everyone could hear. "Is there a problem?" Kenton forced himself to stand taller, though every part of him felt brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Yes," he said clearly, enunciating every word to ensure there was no misunderstanding. "Your attendant is treating me in a discriminatory and unprofessional manner. She forcibly downgraded me from a confirmed first-class seat without valid reason, in front of the entire cabin." Caleb nodded slowly, as if Kenton had asked him to recite poetry in an unfamiliar language. Then he looked at Trina. She widened her eyes in feigned surprise and spoke first. He was being disruptive, Caleb. Loud, aggressive, making other passengers uncomfortable. Kenton's head snapped toward her, mouth opening, but Caleb cut him off with a raised hand. "Let's calm down," he said patronizingly. "We don't want any more scenes." "Scenes," Kenton repeated, his voice cracking despite his best efforts. He closed his eyes for a half second, feeling the heat rising again, pressing against his skull. The economy cabin waited ahead of him, its rows cramped and filled with passengers craning their necks to watch the drama unfold. He felt the weight of their gazes pressing on his shoulders, their eyes gleaming with interest, with judgment, with the sadistic delight people took in watching someone brought low. As he approached the dividing curtain, the dull hush in first class gave way to an ugly murmur in economy, a building buzz of speculation that seemed to vibrate in the recycled air. The security officer followed him at a calculated distance, close enough that the implication was clear. Make one wrong move, say one wrong word, and you're going down in handcuffs. Caleb Wright, the supervisor who had just delivered his corporate execution sentence, had fallen back, his work done, letting the guard's presence do the rest. Behind Kenton, he heard Trina Calloway's voice fade as she resumed her professional, saccharine greeting to new boarding passengers, her tone a jarring contrast to the acid she'd poured over him only moments ago. Kenton didn't dare look back at her. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to let the rage that clawed at his chest escape in the form of a scream that would only justify everything they were saying about him. As he crossed into economy, the first rows went silent, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. A child peered between the seats, his mother gently pulling him back by the shoulder, but not before shooting Kenton a look that was equal parts curiosity and discomfort. He pressed forward, ignoring the way the overhead bins seemed to crowd closer around him, the way the seats seemed smaller, the air thicker, the lighting less forgiving. He felt every inch of status lost in that walk, every dollar of his first-class ticket devalued, as he was forced to keep moving back. Passengers shifted in their seats to make room for him to pass, some huffing in irritation, others staring openly. He heard the chime of a phone camera, the unmistakable click of a video recording starting. He didn't look, but felt it like a dagger in his side. The officer behind him was silent, menacing, offering no words of comfort or apology, just there to ensure the cattle stayed in line. When he reached his reassigned seat, a narrow, middle seat crammed between two strangers who wouldn't even make eye contact, he stopped and inhaled so deeply he felt his ribs protest. He turned stiffly, stowed his carry-on in the overhead with robotic motions, and then sank into the seat, every joint resisting, his body screaming with protest not from the physical discomfort, but from the soul-deep mortification. He didn't dare look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him, the cheap, peeling laminate tray table, the torn airline safety card sticking out of the pouch like a mocking tongue. Around him, people whispered. "Did you see what happened?" One voice murmured, excitement barely contained. "About time someone taught him manners," another voice said, male, smug, certain in its rightness. He clenched his fists in his lap until the nails dug crescents into his palms, the pain a grounding force to keep him from shaking. His breathing was ragged, a tremor running through him he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. The security officer lingered a few rows up, watching him, arms folded, communicating silently to everyone that the problem had been neutralized, that the threat was contained. Across the aisle, a teenage girl pointed her phone at him blatantly, giggling with her friend as she whispered, "Send it to me." He looked so mad. He heard the ping of a message sent, the laugh that followed. He closed his eyes, trying to wall it all out, trying to retreat somewhere no one could reach him. But the plane wouldn't let him. It rattled with movement as the rest of the passengers finished boarding, many casting sidelong glances, their expressions a blend of curiosity and satisfaction that the drama had provided them with an early morning show. In first class, Trina and Caleb would be filing their incident report even now, their version of events clean, neat, damning. Passenger was belligerent. Passenger was aggressive. Passenger refused to comply with instructions. Kenton knew the words before they even typed them. He could imagine Trina's satisfied smirk as she entered them, Caleb's approving nod. He knew those words would live in some airline database forever, a scarlet letter that would follow him onto future flights. Watch out for this one. He could already see the headline that would eventually leak. Because these things always leaked. A blurry cell phone video of him standing stiffly in the aisle, refusing to move, edited carefully to remove the provocation that had come before, would go viral with a single caption: "Entitled passenger refuses to sit in economy." The comments would write themselves. The security officer who had shadowed him during the forced downgrade still lingered in the aisle several rows up, arms folded, gaze flicking his way every so often to make sure the threat had been neutralized. Kenton kept his hands pressed flat against his knees, the fingers tense, the tendons tight as cables. He had no desire to move, no intention of inviting another confrontation. He had been measured, judged, and punished, and now he sat in the place assigned to him, silent, small, contained. But though his body remained still, his mind churned. He played and replayed the moment when Trina had looked him straight in the face and called him aggressive for daring to ask for the service he paid for. He remembered the slow smile that had spread over Caleb Wright's face as he delivered his final condescending threat. He remembered the laughter, the whispers, the cutting words. About time someone taught him manners. The pain was raw, acid in his veins, but it was no longer alone. It mingled with something colder, something sharper, a dangerous, calculating resolve that began to knit itself around the wound. He would not forget this. He would not forgive it. When the plane finally landed in Chicago, the passengers surged to collect their bags. Kenton didn't move until the aisle was almost empty. Even then, he stood slowly, carefully, gathering his carry-on with methodical precision. He walked the length of the jet bridge without looking back, refusing to meet the eyes of the flight attendants who offered their brittle smiles. He didn't dignify the forced politeness with an answer. He kept going, past the gates, past the security checkpoint, out into the arrivals area where the world bustled, unaware of the theater of humiliation that had just played out at 35,000 feet. But if the airline thought it was over, they were wrong, because Kenton wasn't the only witness. 2 days later, a young ramp agent named Desiree Miles sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling through her phone, her expression twisted with anger. She had been on duty that morning when Trina Calloway had bragged about the incident in the cramped staff break room. Desiree had sat there, half hidden behind a rack of high-visibility vests, phone recording discreetly in her lap. She'd caught every word. Trina had been loud, giddy with triumph. You should have seen his face. Trina had cackled, all dressed up, thinking he was better than us. Not our kind of customer. I put him right in his place. Someone else had laughed in the background, muffled but unmistakably complicit. Man, Trina, you're savage, the second voice had said. You know management's gonna love it. He looked like he was gonna cry. Trina had actually snorted. He'll think twice before trying to sneak into first class again. Hell, I'm doing them a favor, teaching them there's standards around here. Desiree had felt bile rise in her throat. She'd known Trina was nasty, but this was vile even by her standards. And management loving it? That was the last straw. She'd saved the audio to her cloud storage before she even clocked out. For 2 days, she wrestled with it. Fear gnawed at her. She was new. She didn't have any real power. But in the end, she couldn't keep it to herself. She emailed the recording to a local journalist known for consumer rights investigations. The journalist was named Simone Burke, and she was nothing if not relentless. Within hours, Simone had confirmed the authenticity of the file. She hadn't stopped there. She had connections inside the airline's corporate offices, people who owed her favors. She began to dig. What she found was worse than anyone imagined. While the audio of Trina's gleeful bigotry began to circulate online, spreading across Twitter and TikTok with captions like "Racist flight, attendant exposed, and listen to how they talk about us," Simone kept pressing her sources. A middle manager in marketing, flustered and frightened, eventually sent her a PDF of internal emails. The thread was damning. It included subject lines like "protecting our brand image" and "strategy for premium customer demographics." Inside, executives discussed toning down outreach to urban markets because those demographics don't align with our first-class experience. One VP even wrote bluntly, "We want to avoid overexposure in cities that skew the numbers. The brand has to stay aspirational." Another chimed in with, "We can't afford a meltdown on social if the cabin doesn't match the brochure. Let's be selective." Simone's fingers flew over the keyboard as she prepared the article. She embedded the audio clip at the top, complete with a transcript. She attached screenshots of the emails. She named names. She didn't hold back. The headline was pure gasoline. "Airline attendant laughs about teaching him a lesson," as executives plot to exclude Black customers from first class. The story went live late that evening. By sunrise, it was everywhere. News channels picked it up for the morning cycle, showing split screens of Trina Calloway's blurry employee ID photo, the text of the most damning emails highlighted in neon yellow. The audio clip played on repeat, anchors making faces of disgust as they listened. Twitter blew up. Hashtags trended. Hashtag flying while black, hashtag boycott the airline, hashtag Trina Calloway exposed. On Reddit, users compiled timelines of the flight, the forced downgrade, the public shaming. Videos taken on the plane that day, previously shared for cruel laughs, were reposted with captions calling them evidence of systemic racism. Even corporate sponsors began pulling advertising. Stock prices wobbled, then began to slide as the scandal deepened. He'd spent the night awake in that room, reading the hundreds of comments on the leaked video of Trina Calloway's hateful laughter, watching her words go viral in clipped, brutal tweets, seeing the airline's stock graph dip red in real time as investors reacted with disgust and fear. He saw the screen grabs of the marketing emails, the deliberate, smug strategizing about which demographics to avoid so first class would stay aspirational. And over, he saw his own face, captured in shaky cell phone video while he stood in the aisle of that plane, refusing to move, trying to keep his voice level while the uniformed supervisor threatened him with removal. The videos had been posted originally to mock him. Now they were evidence. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He hadn't done either on that plane, and he wouldn't do it now. Instead, he felt something cold and precise settle over him. A chilling calm he recognized from high-stakes negotiations when hundreds of millions were on the line, and the wrong word could crater the deal. This was no different. The airline had no idea what they had done. They hadn't humiliated a random passenger. They hadn't crushed a nobody who would slink away quietly. They had targeted Dr. Kenton Price, Harvard-trained, managing partner at Oaktree Venture Partners, the lead negotiator for a $2.9 billion financing package the airline had been chasing for nearly 2 years to save their expansion plan. He wasn't going to remind them with an angry letter or an indignant tweet. He was going to tell the entire world. By noon, the media were crammed into the small conference room the hotel used for business rentals, camera crews jockeying for position, reporters holding out microphones, live feeds blinking on cell phones propped up on tripods. The room hummed with that feral, eager energy reporters got when they knew they were about to see blood. Kenton entered through the side door, moving with a steady, deliberate grace that belied the turmoil roiling in his chest. He wore the same suit he'd flown in 2 days earlier. He'd had it pressed, but if you looked closely, you could still see the faint wrinkle near the lapel where he'd clutched it in his fist on that plane. He didn't try to hide it. Let them see it. He took his place at the lectern, adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat once. The room fell silent. Flashbulbs popped. The feed counters on the live streams jumped into the tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. He let the silence sit for a heartbeat. Then two. Then he spoke. calm, even, surgical. "Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Kenton Price." He paused, letting that settle. He wasn't Mr. He wasn't "Hey, buddy," or "Sir" with a sneer. He was Doctor. Earned. Irrefutable. He continued, "I'm a managing partner at Oaktree Venture Partners. Until this week, I was the lead negotiator for a $2.9 billion expansion financing package with Horizon Airlines." That number dropped like a bomb. The murmurs in the press pool were immediate. Harshly whispered questions to producers in earpieces. Kenton watched them with a cold, clinical satisfaction. He raised a hand slightly for silence. "I want to tell you about the experience I had on Flight 372 from Atlanta to Chicago. I want you to understand what it felt like to be singled out, mocked, downgraded, threatened, ejected from first class in front of dozens of witnesses simply because I didn't look like they thought I should look." His voice didn't rise. He didn't plead. He laid it out like evidence in a courtroom. He described Trina Calloway's mocking smile, the way she had snatched his ticket and performed for the line, how she'd blocked the aisle so everyone could watch, how she'd summoned security when he insisted on the seat he'd paid for, how the passengers had cheered his removal, how he'd sat in economy with every eye on him, humiliated. He talked about the leaked audio, about her words, "Not our kind of customer," about the laughter in the break room, about the emails planning how to tone down outreach to certain demographics so first class stayed aspirational. He read the worst quotes verbatim. The room was silent except for the camera shutters. He waited, let the weight of it sink in. Then he went on. "I was going to sign the final financing commitment this week. I was ready to help Horizon Airlines secure the capital it needed to expand routes, modernize its fleet, and save thousands of jobs. That deal is over." He said it flatly. No apology, no regret, just fact. The silence in the room became suffocating. Then the reporters erupted with questions. He let them yell for a few seconds before raising his hand again. Within the airline's glass and chrome headquarters, the C-suite devolved into open warfare. Board members demanded emergency sessions. Shareholders flooded the investor relations hotline with threats of lawsuits. And in the center of that storm, the CEO tried desperately to find someone, anyone, to blame besides himself. In press conferences, he stammered through prepared remarks, apologizing to anyone who felt offended. His weak non-apology instantly mocked by journalists and late-night hosts alike. But the public wasn't satisfied with platitudes. They wanted accountability. They wanted blood. And the airline's board knew it. They wanted a sacrifice. And they chose Trina Calloway first. It was barely 48 hours after Kenton's press conference when Horizon Airlines' official social media accounts posted a short, carefully lawyered statement. "We take allegations of discriminatory behavior seriously. The employee involved in this incident is no longer with the company." It was a single sentence meant to be an exclamation mark, to show they were decisive, that they wouldn't tolerate racism. But it was too late to seem noble. The statement spread like wildfire, quote-tweeted thousands of times with variations of good. Too little too late. And what about the rest of them? By then, local news outlets had gotten word of where Trina Calloway lived. Paparazzi staked out her small house in a subdivision outside Atlanta. When she emerged that morning, they shouted questions over her car engine. "Did you really say he wasn't your kind of customer? Do you regret humiliating him? What do you say to people calling you a racist?" She tried to keep her head down, but the cameras caught the tears streaking her makeup. When she finally snapped, she shouted at them, voice cracking with rage and fear. "I was set up. It's not fair. I was just doing my job." The video went viral within hours. People dissected every frame. Screenshots of her red tear-streaked face appeared on meme accounts with captions like "Now you're sorry" and "Cry harder." But the public wasn't satisfied. They didn't want just her. They wanted the people who had enabled her, who had encouraged her, who had designed the system that let her behave that way. And that was where Horizon Airlines truly fell apart. Because the journalist who'd broken the story about Trina's audio and the damning marketing emails didn't stop digging. Simone Burke smelled blood, and she was relentless. Within a week, she published another bombshell report showing that senior marketing executives had not only endorsed a plan to tone down outreach to Black urban centers, but had explicitly budgeted for image control if those policies leaked. The report included redacted but unmistakable Slack messages, with one executive writing, "We'll just call them aggressive if it comes up," that always shuts them down. The backlash was immediate and savage. Civil rights groups held press conferences demanding a federal investigation. Black politicians and city leaders called for boycotts of the airline. Class action lawsuits were announced in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Passenger rights attorneys lined up clients. Sponsors pulled advertising from the airline's in-flight magazine and social media feeds. Credit card partners announced they were reviewing their co-branded promotions. The board of directors, now facing a shareholder revolt, demanded the CEO's resignation. He delivered it in another televised press conference, looking 10 years older than he had 2 weeks before, hair disheveled, voice ragged. He didn't even try to deny responsibility. He read the prepared statement like a death notice, hands shaking. "I deeply regret that my leadership failed to uphold the values of inclusion and respect. Effective immediately. I am stepping down." But even that wasn't enough. Over the next few days, the dominoes fell fast. The chief marketing officer, who had signed off on the discriminatory strategy, resigned. The head of customer experience was fired. The senior VP of HR was forced out after it was revealed she'd ignored 3 separate complaints about Trina's behavior from Black flight attendants over the years. Even Caleb Wright, the supervisor who had threatened Kenton with security, was escorted from the building by uniformed guards while cameras rolled outside. His exit video showed him stone-faced, refusing to answer shouted questions. At airports nationwide, Horizon staff arrived to find protesters waiting, holding signs reading "Not our kind of customer" and "Boycott Horizon." Some passengers canceled flights on the spot. Others posted photos tearing up loyalty cards. The stock price hit a new low, wiping billions in shareholder value. Analysts now openly predicted bankruptcy if the company didn't find emergency financing. And they all knew exactly where that financing was supposed to have come from. 6 months passed like a slow exhalation of a battered company's last desperate hope of survival. Horizon Airlines had come to the very brink of collapse in the wake of the scandal that had shredded its reputation, gutted its stock price, and driven away both loyal passengers and corporate partners. Even those who hadn't paid much attention at first could not escape the viral images that circulated for weeks on every platform. The flight attendant's mocking smile, the blurry cell phone footage of Kenton Price standing stiffly in the aisle as security closed in behind him, the headline about a $2.9 billion deal going up in flames overnight. The airline had no choice but to confront its own rot. And so it changed, but not easily, not quickly, and not without blood in the water. The boardroom that had once brimmed with high-priced suits and smug self-assurance was unrecognizable by the time winter set in. Gone were the CEO and the marketing brass who had bragged about keeping first-class aspirational. Gone were the VPs who had signed off on toning down outreach so they wouldn't have to serve passengers who looked like Kenton. Their offices were emptied, nameplates stripped off the doors, the executives slinking away under the searing glare of cameras, and protesters gathered outside headquarters. In their place came new faces, some poached from rival airlines eager to prove their credentials, others elevated from within after passing rounds of grueling interviews that asked hard questions about ethics and inclusion. The new CEO was a woman named Eloise Spencer, a 50-year-old industry veteran who had made her career building diverse teams and mending public trust after scandals. She spoke plainly to the media at her first press conference. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't hide behind corporate speak. "We failed," she said bluntly. "We betrayed our employees and our passengers. We created an environment where bigotry wasn't just tolerated, but quietly encouraged, because it was convenient for our bottom line." That ends today. Behind her were the new executive team, noticeably more diverse than the sea of identical suits that had come before. Reporters grilled her about empty PR gestures, about whether this was just marketing. She shook her head. This isn't a slogan. This is survival. We know we won't win back trust overnight, but we're going to try, every single day. Meanwhile, the airline launched its internal reckoning like a military campaign. They didn't just send out a memo or a link to a 30-minute mandatory training video. They shut down entire terminals for full-day workshops led by civil rights leaders and corporate diversity consultants. Attendance was mandatory for every employee, from baggage handlers to pilots to the board. They invited customers and community leaders to give unfiltered feedback about their experiences. They offered amnesty for employees who wanted to come forward about discriminatory practices, promising no punishment for past silence if they helped root out the problem. They partnered with historically Black colleges and universities to build new recruitment pipelines for leadership roles. They revised hiring and promotion criteria to remove the kinds of subjective culture fit requirements that had always seemed to keep the same kinds of faces in charge. They built a formal, transparent process for passenger complaints and made sure it included a direct line to the CEO's office. They even updated their advertising to feature diverse families and travelers in first class, no longer coyly aiming their marketing at one narrow demographic. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't quick. Some employees quit rather than take part in the changes. Lawsuits continued in the background, but the airline didn't try to sweep them away. Instead, Eloise Spencer would mention them in interviews and say, "We're settling those cases, and we're learning from every single one. We have to." Amid all this, the image of Kenton Price became a touchstone. Not just the humiliating video of him being forced into economy while people jeered, but the one of him at that lectern, spine straight, voice measured, telling the world exactly what had happened. He didn't vanish when the cameras moved on. He wasn't there for revenge, but for change. He met quietly with a new CEO in a glass-walled conference room one chilly morning. No cameras, no press. Just two professionals talking about what went wrong and how to fix it. He didn't charge them for the consultation. He didn't bill them for his time. When she offered, he shook his head and said, "My fee is seeing you actually do it." He sat with training designers to share his experience so they could build it into their curriculum. He reviewed new marketing plans to help spot dog whistles and coded exclusions. He connected the airline with nonprofits that specialized in passenger advocacy and civil rights education. And he did it all with the same precise, measured calm he'd used in the boardrooms of venture capital, even as the memory of that flight still sat heavy in his gut. He never forgot what they did to him. But he also refused to let that moment be the only story that got told. He wanted the ending to be different. He wanted it to mean something. And on the other side of country, Trina Calloway was learning the same lesson in a far different way. She had lost everything in the scandal, fired publicly, shamed virally, filmed screaming that she was set up, while cameras captured her tears and snot and red-faced rage for the world to dissect frame by frame. She'd been evicted when she couldn't make rent. The airline blacklisted her, and no other carrier wanted the risk of hiring her after the recordings. For months she drifted, couch to couch, shelter to shelter, until she landed at a nail salon in a rundown strip mall off the highway, a place that paid her cash to sweep up clippings and wipe down counters. The owner let her work in the back because customers didn't want to see her face. She spent her days scrubbing stains from floors and picking at old polish from basins, listening to the hiss of the dryers and the murmured conversations of women who didn't know or didn't care who she was. Alone, she replayed the viral video of herself, the one where she laughed in the break room about not our kind of customer. At first, she had told herself it was all out of context, that she'd just been joking, that anyone would have snapped in her place. But the more she watched it, the less convincing her excuses became. She heard the cruelty in her own voice, the delight she'd taken in making someone feel small. She saw the faces of the people in the plane, remembered their laughter, remembered his face as he tried to stay calm. She cried for days, alone in that cramped back room. She didn't have a therapist. She didn't have friends left to listen. But one day she walked to the local library, used the battered computer, and searched for volunteer opportunities. She found a local nonprofit that did racial justice education, specializing in teaching corporate employees how to recognize and fight bias. She showed up at their office with red eyes and a crumpled printout. The director didn't turn her away. They made her sit in the circle. They made her listen. They made her talk. She didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't get it, but she got understanding of what she'd done, piece by painful piece. She started volunteering, answering phones, making coffee, running errands, sitting in on sessions, learning. One day she told her story to a new group, voice shaking. "I was the racist flight attendant in the video," she said. "I hurt someone because I could, because I thought it was funny, because I thought he couldn't do anything about it. I'm here because I don't want to be that person again." The room was silent, and then they went on with the work. And somewhere across the country, Kenton Price continued his own version of the work, reviewing new training proposals in another glass-walled boardroom, eyes hard but patient. Because he didn't want revenge. He wanted change. And that was the end he insisted on. Not just for himself, for everyone. The end. If you enjoyed reading this story and want to see more gripping narratives like it, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss future installments. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the plot. Did it surprise you, move you, make you think? Let's talk about it in the comments. Tell me what stood out most, what you'd change, or what you want to see next. And let me know where you're reading from today. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel and who they resonate with around the world. Let's keep this conversation going.